This is the story of a highly affluent place, yet one where the price of a human life was valued less than a single grain of sugar. It was a horrific place where if you were born into the majority, your destiny was already sealed to work yourself to death in less than a year, or face the amputation of your limbs if you dared to escape. To the global superpowers of the 18th century, this colony was a gold mine that could not be lost. However, to the hundreds of thousands of oppressed souls within it, this place was nothing short of a living hell. Interestingly, it was from the darkest corner of this hell that an event was born which became most feared by kings and emperors across the earth, a rebellion initially deemed impossible, yet one that successfully shook the global order and altered the map of world history forever. In the decade of the 1780s, the territory of Saint-Domingue, which would later give birth to the nation of Haiti, stood as the crown jewel of the French colonial empire and the most profitable colony in the entire world. This small island in the Caribbean transformed into a massive economic engine that independently supplied nearly half of all sugar and coffee commodities consumed by European society. This extraordinary wealth spun upon the wheels of highly efficient yet bloody chattel plantations, rendering Saint-Domingue a crucial transatlantic trade hub for Paris's finances. However, behind this glittering facade of prosperity lay a deeply fragile and fragmented social structure akin to a ticking time bomb. At the apex of the hierarchy perched the Grands Blancs, wealthy white plantation owners and colonial officials who lived in extreme luxury yet were constantly enveloped in paranoia. Beneath them was the Petits Blancs group, lower-class white citizens such as artisans, plantation overseers, and small merchants, who did not possess great wealth like the elite, but were fiercely defensive of their racial supremacy. This internal tension was further complicated by the existence of the gens de couleur, a group of free people of color, mulattoes, who were often economically prosperous and even owned slaves themselves, yet their civil and political rights were legally castrated by French colonial racist laws. Meanwhile, at the base of this unequal social pyramid lived the absolute majority of the colony's population, hundreds of thousands of slaves of African origin, whose numbers reached nearly 90% of the total population. They were forced to work to the limits of human physical capacity under the scorching Caribbean sun, threatened by whips, mutilation, and brutal executions enforced by overseers to maintain productivity. The mortality rate on the sugar plantations was so high due to forced labor and disease that France had to continuously import thousands of new slaves every year to sustain the workforce. Amidst this hell of extreme suffering and tight isolation between plantation estates, the slaves refused to completely submit. They began to weave underground solidarity networks using two fundamental cultural elements: Creole, Haitian Creole, as a lingua franca that bridged the differences of their ancestral tribes in Africa, and the spiritual ritual of voodoo. Voodoo was not merely a belief system, rather, it was a sacred space of cultural resistance, a secret medium where they could gather clandestinely, restore their human dignity, and consolidate their collective rage. It was this spiritual and linguistic network that later in August 1791, under the leadership of Boukman Doutai, during the Bois Cayman ceremony, became the primary spark for the eruption of the Haitian Revolution, the most successful slave rebellion in human history. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789 with its radical declaration of human rights, liberty, and equality, its ideological resonance immediately crossed the Atlantic Ocean and struck Saint-Domingue like a massive wave. Ironically, however, these Enlightenment jargons from Paris were interpreted differently by each social class in the colony. The Grands Blancs saw the revolution as an opportunity to break free from Paris's strict trade controls, while the gens de couleur, free people of color, demanded the equality of civil rights promised by the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Fierce political and armed conflicts subsequently broke out between these white factions and the mulatto class. Preoccupied with attacking one another to maintain or seize power, The colony's ruling elite grew complacent and failed to realize that their structure of oppression was fracturing from within. They completely ignored the greatest threat that had been lurking in the shadows of the plantations all along, the rage of hundreds of thousands of slaves, which was far more massive and organized. The pivotal moment that changed the course of history finally arrived on the night of August 14, 1791, in a remote forest called Bois Cayman. Under flashes of lightning and a heavy downpour of a rainstorm, a charismatic voodoo spiritual leader and carriage driver named Duddy Boukman, along with a priestess named Cecile Fatiman, gathered slave representatives from various plantations in the northern region. In that sacred and emotional voodoo ritual, they slaughtered a black pig and took a blood oath that bound them to fight to the death to seize their freedom. Just days after that night of affirmation, this clandestine plan exploded into a neatly coordinated mass rebellion. The northern region of Saint-Domingue instantly turned into a horrific sea of fire. Hundreds of sugarcane fields, sugar refineries, and luxurious mansions belonging to colonial masters were burned to ashes. Machetes that for years had been used to cut cane under the threat of the whip were now repurposed as weapons of mass retribution, shattering the economic foundations of France and completely paralyzing the world's most prosperous colony in an instant. Amidst the chaos of the multi-factional war consuming Saint-Domingue, where the imperial powers of Spain and Great Britain also invaded the island to dismantle French dominance and secure their own economic gains, a genius figure emerged who altered the course of history: Toussaint Louverture. As an educated former slave who gained freedom in his middle age, Louverture proved himself to be a brilliant military strategist and a highly accomplished diplomat. With his tactical intelligence, he successfully transformed a mass of rebellious slaves, who were previously disorganized and poorly armed, into a modern army that was highly disciplined and feared. Louverture cleverly combined mountain guerrilla tactics, which utilized the rugged Caribbean terrain, with the organizational structure and combat formations of the European military. His charismatic leadership ability was capable of uniting various factions, making him a major political force that no empire in the world could ignore. To save its colony, which was increasingly cornered by the British invasion, intended to seize Saint-Domingue and reinstate the institution of slavery for their own profit, the revolutionary French government in Paris took a radical step in 1794 by officially abolishing slavery throughout its colonies. This strategic move successfully won over Louverture, who then decided to turn and defend the French flag, mobilizing his forces to expel the British and Spanish armies from the island. After successfully stabilizing the territory from external threats, Louverture had to face an internal challenge in the War of Knives, a bloody civil war against his political rival, André Rigaud, who led the Gens de Couleur group in the southern region. A decisive victory over Rigaud solidified Louverture's full control over the entire island. The pinnacle came in 1801, when he drafted the monumental Constitution of Saint-Domingue. This constitution boldly declared the territory as a self-governing nation, sovereign state, appointed himself as governor for life, and absolutely prohibited all forms of slavery and racial discrimination forever. Louverture's daring move in drafting the 1801 Constitution ignited tremendous fury from France's ambitious new ruler, Napoleon Bonaparte. For Napoleon, the existence of an autonomous government in his most valuable colony, led by a black former slave, was an intolerable insult to French imperial supremacy. Therefore, in early 1802, Napoleon launched a massive military expedition by sending a giant armada carrying more than 20,000 elite troops, veterans of European wars, under the command of his own brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc. Their mission was crystal clear: regain full control of the island, disarm the black population, and capture Louverture. Although Louverture's forces put up fierce guerrilla resistance in the interior, the French superiority in numbers and tactics gradually pressed them. General Leclerc then employed a cunning ruse. He invited Louverture to a peace meeting under the pretense of negotiation, but instead immediately seized him, bound him in chains, and deported him to France, where the liberator eventually passed away in solitude within the freezing prison cell of Fort de Joux in April 1803. However, Louverture's arrest did not halt the course of the revolution. Instead, it served as new fuel that inflamed the battle to a far more horrific level. When rumors spread that France had restored slavery in neighboring colonies like Guadeloupe and was preparing to do the same in Saint-Domingue, mass outrage exploded into a brutal total war. Leadership of the resistance now passed into the hands of General Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a warlord notorious for being merciless and who championed the motto, liberty or death. Under his command, the revolutionary forces launched scorched earth tactics to drive out the colonizers. At the same time, nature sided with the freedom fighters. A massive outbreak of yellow fever struck the French military barracks, killing thousands of elite soldiers, including General Leclerc himself. The destruction of French military morale and strength forced them to surrender after a crushing defeat at the Battle of Vertières in November 1803. This total failure shattered Napoleon's ambitions to build a grand empire on the American continent, which in turn forced him to sell the vast territory of French Louisiana to the United States, the Louisiana Purchase. Finally, on January 1st, 1804, General Jean-Jacques Dessalines officially proclaimed the independence of the territory and restored its original Arawak name, Haiti. This historic event marked the establishment of the world's first independent black republic, as well as the only slave rebellion in human history that successfully overthrew a colonial empire and gave birth to a sovereign nation. Although Haiti had proclaimed its independence with blood and tears, the epic victory on the battlefield turned out to come at a heavy cost at the international diplomacy table. The superpowers of that era, such as France, Great Britain, and the United States, resolutely refused to recognize the sovereignty of this first black republic out of fear that the virus of slave freedom would spread to their own colonies. Economically isolated and threatened by subsequent military invasions, Haiti was forced to its knees in 1825 when France sent warships to the coast of Port-au-Prince. Under the threat of cannons, France demanded an absurd financial compensation of 150 million francs, later reduced to 90 million francs, as restitution for the loss of land and property in the form of the freed slaves. To settle this unjust independence debt, Haiti became trapped in a vicious cycle of foreign loans from French and American banks. Ironically, instead of building infrastructure and education for its newly liberated citizens, nearly the entirety of Haiti's state revenue for more than a century was drained just to pay reparations to their former colonizers, leaving the nation's economic foundation in prolonged paralysis until the mid-20th century. The historical tragedy experienced by Haiti serves as both a mirror and a warning that colonialism never truly vanished. Rather, it transformed into a subtler guise in the modern era. The exploitative practices of the past have now manifested as neocolonialism or disguised colonization, where the subjugation of a nation no longer uses the barrels of cannons or military might, but instead utilizes the shackles of financial debt, technological dependence, and asymmetrical trade agreements. Global financial institutions and multinational corporations frequently dictate the domestic policies of developing countries, extracting their natural resource wealth while leaving local communities in systemic poverty. Political sovereignty that appears on the surface is often illusory when a country's economic policies are controlled by foreign powers. Ultimately, the history of the Haitian Revolution teaches us that the struggle against oppression is an ongoing endeavor. True freedom is not merely possessing a flag and a national anthem, but rather a nation's capacity to be economically independent and fully sovereign over its own destiny without being dictated to by any external power.